Hey team, welcome back. So before we continue to setting up Redux and also start making API calls to our backend, I do want to talk a little bit about architecture. And this is going to be very helpful because it's going to help you get some context in regards or surrounding the use cases that we're going to be implementing. Now, when I learned Redux, I do have to say that it took me a while to get the hang of it. And the main reason why is that some of the explanations that you get in most tutorials are very generic, right? They talk about the store and they talk about the state management, but it's very hard to understand the context in which you're using Redux until you actually have a use case in front of you. And this was true for me because it wasn't until I actually worked on a full stack application using Node.js on the back end and React and Redux on the front end. An application, or actually a project, a full stack project, very similar to the one we're implementing, just significantly simpler in terms of functionality. It wasn't until then that I started actually literally drafting on my whiteboard here in my office, and I started understanding the flow and the use cases. And since we're actually having a practical project on React and Redux, then instead of me giving you just an explanation on Redux as if this was like an introduction to the technologies, I rather just walk you through the use cases that we're going to be implementing. And the first use case that we're going to implement in which we're going to use Redux is going to be when we add a project. So I just want to walk you through the flow, and once we start working on this in the next lecture, in the next few lectures, then I'll make sure that we come back to this, and I promise at that point everything's going to make a lot of sense. So basically here we have our add project component, and usually the way this works is that you call an action, and this action, which is where we're going to wire up Axios, is what's going to call the API, or it's what's going to interact with the API, in our case with our SpringBoot backend. In our use case, as you know, and we worked on the SpringBoot backend just a few lectures ago, when you send a project object, if it's valid, then it's going to return errors. If it's valid, it's going to return the project object that was persisted. If we send an invalid project object, then we're going to get an object containing errors, depending on the fields or the invalid fields that we're passing on to our server. And I'm pretty sure you can recall that from previous lectures. Okay, so now the use case is the following. We send a project object from the form. This goes to the SpringBoot backend. And then the happy path is that it's a valid project object, in which case it goes straight onto just reloading our dashboard. Okay, in this use case, in this very specific use case, we're not using a reducer or Redux to update our store, but what's going to happen is that we're going to reload our dashboard, which is where we have our collection of projects, and then the dashboard itself is going to have its own setup to get the projects from the API and actually update the state and whatnot, which is the next use case that we're going to talk about. But again, I don't want to confuse you. For now, all you need to know is that we're going to set up the project action. We're going to send the post request to our backend. Then our backend is going to come back with the project if it was successful. And if it's successful, then it's going to send us back to the dashboard. Now, if we send garbage, if we send a bad project, then our Spring Boot application is going to come back with an array of errors. And I'm pretty sure you remember when we were working on Postman, we will get an object containing the errors. Now, if we get errors, then our project action is going to dispatch, and this is a keyword, is going to dispatch, and this is what we're using thunk for. And once we install it, you'll see what I'm talking about. Our project action is going to dispatch an action, which is going to be get errors, and that's when our reducer comes into play. And what our reducer is going to do is that it's going to take the action and it's going to take the payload containing the errors and it's going to update our Redux store. And the Redux store is what's at the core of Redux in general, because it's a store, literally a store, that contains the state of our application. And then at this point, what we're doing is actually putting the errors in the state. And as you remember in the initial lecture of this section, I mentioned that what Redux is basically a state management library, okay? And the Redux store is at the core of its functionality, right? And a reducer, depending on the action, is how we interact, how we dispatch the payload, and it is how that payload gets introduced into the store, okay? Once the errors are here, in this very specific use case, then we have to connect our add project component to the store. Then we have to map the state to props, right? Then we have to make sure that we receive the new props, which means when this is loaded, it receives properties. When we send an invalid project object, then we have to set it up so that we can get the new props, i.e. for example, the new object containing the errors. And then at that point, we're going to set the new state in the error subject within the project component, which we still have to set up, by the way, but that will be super simple. And then at that point, we're going to display the errors. And just so that I don't give you some whatever lecture on what it is that we're doing here, I am going to show you what this looks like in our application, in the application that we have on the cloud, which is the first version of this. So if I go here and create a project and I submit garbage, if I try and submit a blank, that's when we start getting our project objects. And if I go here to inspect and I go to my Redux extension, which you should have by now, then you're gonna see that in the state we get the error subject that we were getting on Postman when we first wired up the backend. All right. So again, if I refresh this and I try again, then you see how it loads. And this is what we're going to be setting up in the next few lectures. So I just wanted to make sure that this is clear for you. Then the other use case that we're going to implement is when we load the dashboard. And what's going to happen here is that the dashboard is going to call the project actions. And the project action is going to have a method called getProjects, or a function getProjects, which is going to go to our API, which we already wired this up on SpringBoot, by the way. It's basically going to call that backend, the backend, that specific endpoint with a get request. It's going to return our projects. Then what we're going to do is we're going to load those projects. We're going to dispatch the getProjects action and the payload containing the project list onto our Redux store. So the reducer is going to take that payload to a Redux store, and then we're going to connect the dashboard component to the store. Then we're going to map our state to props. I don't think we have any errors here, but what we're going to do is then display the list of errors. And all this that I just showed you is basically what happens when you try to go to the dashboard. And as you can see, it took a second there, and then it actually took the projects from the state and displayed them on the screen. And this is exactly the first two use cases that we're going to implement in this project. Okay, so I hope that this is super clear. Well, actually, I don't think it's going to be clear right this second, but I hope that once we implement these two use cases, then you can come back to this video and make sure that you make sense of it, and make sure that you don't move forward until this makes sense, even if it's just at a procedural level, as in like, okay, I have to create the component, then I have to create the action, then I have to wire it up so it calls the API, then I have to create the reducer that sends the project to the store, and then I have to get the state from the store by hooking up the component and then displaying what's coming from the state. Because if you can, as you can see here, what we're getting here is nothing more than the projects that we have right here on our display are the projects that we're getting from our state. All right, so I hope this gives you a good introduction of what it is that we're gonna do. And like I said, instead of me explaining to you what Redux is, I'd rather explain to you what we're gonna use it for, and that's gonna not only help you understand it better, but also it's gonna help you get creative with this, and then actually start, coming up with use cases for it. One last thing that I do want to discuss in this lecture is support. We are navigating into deep waters. Redux and React are not difficult, but they do have a lot of moving parts, and making mistakes is almost inevitable. Typos here and there. You can ask my wife how many hours I've spent on fixing a comma, like fixing a bug that ended up being a comma, and it happens, right? So make sure that if you get stuck in a very specific lecture, that you go to the branch related to that lecture. Okay, in each lecture you're going to see a specific branch. The branch contains the code that I committed as I wrapped up that lecture. So that means that whatever test you saw on the screen that passed, that actually that good code is in that branch. Okay, so if you, for some reason, you're following along and the code is not working for you, please try and follow my initial recommendation, which is to try and rewatch the lecture if you have time. Make sure that you really understand what broke the application. And also, before you rush onto the QA section, and I'm not discouraging you from going into the QA section, I'm going to be more than happy to help you out. What I'm trying to do is actually giving you tools so you can unstuck yourself faster rather than waiting for me to get back to you, because I don't want you to be frustrated just sitting around waiting for help when you can actually help yourself. Okay, so let's say you're in the video that it's related to branch 19, right? And I'm getting ahead of myself. Don't worry about the code. I just want to show this, okay? So let's say you finish the video that's related to branch 19, and then at that moment things are not working for you. Okay, go to branch 19. I'm putting all the branches here, and this is work in progress right now, so that's why you don't see all the branches. Go to branch 19 and go to the latest commit right here. This is very simple. When you go to the latest commit, you're going to be able to see all the files that I created, and everything that's in green means that it's new, that it was committed on that branch, that it's brand new, that it didn't exist before that branch. So here you know that on branch 19, I created the project actions file. Here you know that I also created the types.js files in the actions folder. Here you know that the add project.js, I erased the console log and then I replaced it by this .profs.create project. Then you see here that I deleted this export default project and actually added these lines here. And this will help you go file by file, all the files that I changed in that specific lecture and what I did to them. And this is going to help you find whatever typos you might have in your code, and it's going to help you move faster if this is not a problem with your environment. If it's a problem with your environment, of course I'll try to help, but I'm not sitting in front of your computer, so you should be more than capable to helping yourself if there's a problem with the environment. Of course, you can always ask me. If I know, I'll try and help out, but I most likely will only be able to help you with problems with your code. But again, 99% of the time, you're going to be able to solve your own problems if you just make sure that you go to the branch, to the latest commit, and then take a look at what it is that I did in that lecture. And I promise you, you're going to be just fine. It's just going to take a little more time. But again, this is way better than just waiting a few hours for me to get back to you. All right. And now if this doesn't work, then at that point, of course, I'll be more than happy to take a look. Always remember to commit your code. And if you need help if you want me to take a look at your code, please send it out. All right. Okay, so it was my pleasure to give you this lecture on architecture. I hope that this brings some context to what we're going to do in the next few videos, and I'll see you inside.